Okay, I think it's probably about November 10th today or so, and I am walking not quite as nice as it was back in early November. I remember even November 5th and 6th were really beautiful sunny days. Weather's got a little bit colder, a little more overcast, but still pretty mild weather, and we haven't had that much rain, though things aren't feeling very dry either. So all in all, it's been a pretty nice autumn. We did bonfire night the other day, and then one of our friends borrowed a pizza oven from Transition Network, and we had a nice pizza night in their back garden. All the kids running around playing tag, playing tig, and it was just a really nice night. I feel like the village that we live in has really had an influx of young families over the last few years, and it's just so great to see the kids running around and playing with each other, and just starting to get a really nice gang, a really good cohort of like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds who are always kind of palling around in different groups. So that's been really nice. On Friday, so I don't know what the date was, but on Friday we had Dr. Callum Leese come over to kind of to observe, kind of help out with one of our Nature Moves classes. So with our Nature Moves classes, we're working with adults primarily in their late 60s, 70s, some people in their early 80s, and they tend to be sort of very playful, inclusive classes with a big emphasis on task-based training. So rather than thinking about sets and reps, we're trying to recreate a sort of boot camp or sort of a competitive fitness environment. We do a lot with playing games and movement problem solving and just trying around different positions, and it's task-based, so a lot of what we do is just getting down on the ground, getting back up again, getting from point A to point B, picking things up, carrying them, and things like that. And we actually brought out the foam swords, the boffers, the LARPing swords. So I made a bunch of LARPing swords for my kids a few months back, and they've just become a really popular toy with the kids in the neighborhood, where they'll just sort of run around and whack each other with swords. And I really like it because the kids in the neighborhood will play. We don't supervise them, and they do a very good job of sort of moderating their own rules and calibrating how hard they hit each other, and a lot of interesting games and rules emerge from it. And you're seeing the kids are getting much better at it. They're not just waving the swords around and whacking each other. You're seeing really interesting behaviors and techniques and strategies emerge out of that. But they also do a very good job of ensuring everyone can participate. So in the group of kids, sometimes I think we've got a few 11, 12, even 13-year-olds who come over, and they always find variations that allow the 4 and 5-year-olds to participate as well. And obviously, kids do end up crying, and every half hour or so, a kid will start crying because they get whacked a little bit too hard, or they're startled, or they fall over, or whatever. But they're having such a good time, they generally just pick themselves up and get back into it again. And we've been doing this since about April, and more kids are coming over and playing with the swords, and the parents seem okay with it. I don't think it's seen as anything that's promoting violence or anything. It's just been a nice thing, so we might maybe try to get some kind of team event going. In one of my podcasts, I talk with Shelby at Force of Nature about this new game called Jugger, so I'm going to have to look into that. Anyway, today's guest is, like I was saying, is Callum Leese, and he came by to observe the class, and we had about 40 minutes left over, so we thought we'd do a quick podcast episode. And you can tell with the podcast that we'd both just had a conversation the way over, so it was sort of in the middle. We were having a nice chat, and then we thought, well, hey, why not turn this into a podcast anyway? So that's what we did. We set up the microphone and had a chat with each other. I actually forgot to set up my microphone properly, so the sound might not be great on this one. But we had a really good chat, and I was prepared to interview Callum. I had some questions set up about the work he's doing, but we kind of put the questions aside and just focused on a nice 40-minute chat. So we kind of went back and forth asking each other's questions, and there's a point where we almost veer into politics, but I think we do a good job of pulling that away. But then, sometimes when you talk about things like physical activity and access to green space, it does turn political. doesn't necessarily need to be partisan, but sometimes when you talk about big ideas like this, you do end up talking about things like governance and funding and things like that. That's a bit inevitable. History is going to come up as well. Callum's he's just a really good guy. He's super enthusiastic, really knowledgeable. I guess I should say a bit more about him. He is a GP, and he also works as a lecturer as well at Dundee, and he's been working in all kinds of things. He's sort of a specialist in physical activity. He's behind a bunch of really good initiatives. He's behind the Healthiest Town initiative over in Aberfeldy, and I think some really good things are coming out of that. He's also very active in the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, and I think they do some very good things there. I think it's great to get GPs and other medical professionals to take a broader view at health and wellness. And he's, I think, very thoughtful when we talk about things like that. And he also has his own podcast called The Movement Prescription, which is excellent. You get some really just great, just bright, real sort of good mix of medical professionals and physical activity promoters and just wellness specialists. So it's a really good podcast. I really recommend you listen to that as well. I'd really like to get Callum back on in a few months where I can just really kind of interview him and learn more about what he's doing, because he is, I think, just he's a real force for good right now. He's got a lot of enthusiasm, and I think that enthusiasm that he has is really contagious. And when you see him interact with other people, people get very excited and they want to do good things. So he's a young guy, and I suspect he'll do a lot of good in the next few years. So anyway, this is my chat with Callum Leese. We talk about a lot of things. We tend to get quite philosophical when we talk, so we talk a lot about perception and cultural norms, building communities, barriers to physical activity, all kinds of things. Give it a listen. It's about 40 minutes long, so a little bit shorter than we normally do, but I think we pack a lot in there. In the show notes, I'll go ahead and link to some of the initiatives that he's involved with.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
So I'm here today with Dr. Callum Leese, and we've already been having a conversation. Just to orient everybody, it is November 8th, which may or may not be relevant to you, but it's 2 days after the American election, which has gotten me in a very thoughtful mood. And Callum and I have just had a good conversation about all kinds of things, and we thought we'd go ahead and throw the microphone on just to see where our brains are at. So Callum, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's been a really nice morning. We've gone around, we've done some moving, and I think we just get right into it. What's been on your mind recently?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations over the last probably 2-3 months, really, and one of the things that you put me in contact with was Wendell Berry, or particularly as a speech he gave in '94, I think it was.
Yeah,
and he's got this wonderful quote where he talks about kind of communities being the smallest unit of health.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the big thing that has been on my mind is really that is kind of community based health, and what does it look like, and what's its value. So yeah, I suppose that's kind of the thing that's been occupying my thoughts for probably a couple of months now.
When we were talking, we were walking over the field. You were sort of talking about this idea of individuality, which is something I've sort of been grappling with as well, and I think it's well covered in the Wendell Berry speech. I think it's something that he speaks and writes about very eloquently. But sort of this focus on the self, and how in some ways, if we perceive that there's societal breakdown happening, it's that people have we spend too much time thinking of ourselves as individual islands, too much time thinking of ourselves as individuals who are completely hermetically sealed and cut off from everyone around us. And it's one of the things I've been struggling with a lot. And it's probably one of the things where I thought was very challenging from a public health standpoint. And now I'm no longer working in public health. But for you, someone who is really active and very thoughtful in working in medicine, working as a GP, I thought you might have some interesting insight that maybe start off talking about what you've kind of perceived your experience as working as a GP and where your mind is on how to start maybe evaluating or changing the narrative on the way people think about this.
Yeah, I suppose I come with kind of two backgrounds, two experiences. One is as a clinician. One is as a researcher, albeit the quality of that might be in question. But yeah, a lot of the research I do is looking at physical activity.
Yes.
And I've done a few pieces of work recently on the barriers and facilitators. And what comes out time and time again is one of the biggest facilitators of people being active is having a strong and supportive social network.
Yes.
I think the reverse there is also true, and I think we shouldn't forget that. And I think, for example, in chronic pain, if you have family and friends which are worried about you performing physical activity because you might worsen the pain,
yes,
that it will prevent you or make it much harder for you to do exercise or physical activity. And the same with diabetes, for example. If you have if you're a kid and you've got type 1 diabetes, I think naturally parents have a very rational fear about hypoglycemia whilst doing physical activity, and so might put barriers in place to that kid. So yeah, I think it's undeniable that our social influences are one of the biggest determinants of our health.
Yes.
We were briefly talking about Michael Marmot's book, The Health Gap, and if we believe, and if we're mindful of the fact that the people around us have a huge influence on our health because they inspire or influence what we do as behaviors, then if you boil that down, there's got to be a point whereby you got to question, can you be a healthy individual
yes,
in an unhealthy environment? And so for you to be healthy, you need to make the people around you healthy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And yeah, I suppose coming back to that, the conversation we had on the field and the walk over here and the kind of individualism, I think one of the core things that we have to be able to meet other, or need to have to be able to meet other people and live in communities, empathy is understanding. One of the big challenges we face is objectivity, or treating others as objects. And I think that's something that's come out of the American election, isn't it? There's the identity politics, the inability to see the other side. And I not delighted with the result, but I acknowledge that I was also surprised by the result. And maybe that's because I couldn't put myself in the shoes of the people that had the 71 plus million that voted for Trump. I've been really guilty of this personally. And then as I've been thinking about this, I realized that actually before that, I've probably created an object of my own body. Tiredness is something to overcome.
Yes.
Pain during workouts is something to overcome. Illness is something to just park and keep going.
Yeah.
And maybe that distinction comes again. We briefly mentioned this, that we've divided in, and I say we as the kind of the role we, but as a health profession, we've kind of almost artificially divided things into mental health and physical health, and so we've created this division. And the physical body is almost the objective part.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on a lot there. That's really good. I think that we could just sort of unpack that for the rest of the 40 minutes that we have. I mean, yeah, one of the big things that you're right. So, going back to the Wendell Berry quote, where the smallest unit of health is the community, and I think people talk about things like obesogenic environments, or salutogenic environments, like what is like a health promoting environment versus, a maladaptive environment. But it's even like, as you were saying, your community creates your reality. And that really touches into what's happening in America right now, the sense of consensus reality. But I always think it's always interesting how different cultures have completely different understandings of health and mental health as well. It's always,
Mm.
like the classic one is people will talk about how in Korea, you get these warnings on the box of fans saying, don't sleep next to this fan because you could die of fan death. And there's this belief that if you sleep next to a fan that's circulating air, you could die, and we think that that's absolutely ridiculous, but people believe enough. And obviously it's some sort of diagnosis of exclusion where something is captured in that, much in the same way that we might use schizophrenia or ADHD as a catch-all for like a whole cluster of different issues. It's always interesting to me how when you go to different cultures, the way they make sense of the world and the way that they, even like the way they do healing. Like I was just reading a Barbara Ehrenreich book where she kind of talks about the ritual power of modern medicine, versus traditional medicine that anthropologists study. But yeah, what you talked about with this idea of objectifying people, and we talked about this briefly, this solipsism that seems to be sneaking into the way a lot of people thinking. So people just sort of thinking the people around them aren't real. And we talked about how online there's this meme, this NPC meme of saying that, well, these other people I disagree with, they're not real people. They're non-playable characters. They're just video game characters who are just there to get in my way. In the big quest, it's really troubling. And then I realized that I'm guilty of it as well, because with the Trump thing, which I'm struggling with right now, I think I expected it actually, but it still has forced me to, I need to start rebuilding my priors, because I remember the first time Trump won in 2016, I was absolutely blown away. And I'm like, how could this happen? But then the interesting thing is that, now Trump has grown, he got the popular vote, he's become more popular with Arab Americans, more popular with Latino Americans, essentially, you know, beat the Democrats on almost every level. I think it means that the model that I have of making sense of the world is not right. I think that I've been just as guilty of that. Um, so I guess with that is how do we start changing culture? Not necessarily in the big American political stuff. That's too big.
Yeah.
That's too big. I think I'm going to get away from national politics for a while. I want to get down into a community level and actually start trying to make positive changes in ways that I know that I can have some agency in making the world a better place, and something that I'm capable, somewhere I have like the levers to start doing it. So how do we do that?
My expertise definitely isn't in psychology or politics, so I'll possibly move away from that. I think it's a really good question, and yeah, I suppose another thing I've been wrestling with is how do we do that and address inequalities simultaneously.
Yes.
And then on the other hand is well, for example, I think the Health Foundation in 2022 wrote a really interesting report which talked about behavior change interventions requiring agency, short for knowledge, skills, motivation, to be successful, and people in higher social economic classes have more agency.
Yes.
And so policies based at an individual behavior change level possibly widen inequalities. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. I think they need to be complemented, but I think there's still a good argument to do them. We can't decrease inequalities by just pulling the top down. Does that make sense? I think it's about bringing people up.
Yeah, that is interesting. When you think about how many public health interventions or even educational interventions or campaigns do seem to have a disproportionate benefit for the middle class, because people, for whatever reason, they have the resources to capitalize on them or take advantage of them. But you're right, that does create a real challenge, because it seems like again, maybe it means that the model is wrong, but you're right. I think we do need to work with some kind of positive model of trying to build things up.
Yeah.
Unless there's there's something that we're blind to, like where the existence of a certain level of inequality makes that tough. It's funny because I don't think either one of us wants to get into politics in this conversation. But I was listening to a historian, Gary Gerstle, I think, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, and he just has the stat that at the end of World War II, so in the 1940s, the top end tax rate in America was about 91%. And it was also a period which isn't entirely true because you have to account for the racism and structural issues at the time, and the issues with gender imbalances and things like that. But from a financial, from a broad level, it was also the period that we had the lowest levels of inequality. And obviously, over time, as the tax changes, where like the top end tax rate now is probably functionally much, much lower for ultra rich people than it is for middle class people or working class people, because obviously you have all the loopholes and the ways to work around it and everything. And you think, gosh, how different would the world be if the top billionaires in the world were giving the vast majority of their wealth back to redistribute? And that's a really tough one, because that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But then you look at the inequality rates in other countries that do have what people would call a more progressive taxation system, and it does seem to have benefits. I think if you look at Marmot studies and things like that, we do seem to see that it kind of helps with the social continuum.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and there's, I think at times we live in a disconnected society. We maybe don't perceive the extent of those inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
I speak as someone in a privileged position. Do I really understand what people struggle with, that are finding it hard to put food on the table? Or I don't know if I do. Yeah, and I suppose when you asked about bringing things, you maybe moving away from politics, bringing things to a community level, having, making it personal. I don't know what a community of health, or maybe reframe that as an inclusive community looks like. I know we talked previously about your experience with CrossFit. I think that's a really interesting one, and I don't know if I'm sure you have unpacked that in other pods before, but yeah, CrossFit being this actually an amazing example of community, but an exclusive community. And the core of it being, and I know at Wildstrong you're trying to take some of the pros, some of the things we can learn from what CrossFit's achieved, but try and make it a more inclusive community. What do you think? What are the key elements? I'm putting you on the spot here.
No.
What do you think the key elements of what you're trying to do at Wildstrong in terms of creating the community are, and those lessons, can we distill them into our day-to-day lives?
Turning the interview around. I'm supposed to be interviewing you. No, it's interesting because I think about Robert Putnam a lot, who wrote Bowling Alone. And is actually in conversation, well, not contemporarily, but a lot of his book was written as a response to some of de Tocqueville's observations when he wrote Democracy in America. And Putnam was sort of looking at the decline of social engagement in American clubs and American civic institutions and American civic organizations from World War II onwards. So you used to have the Shriners, and it doesn't matter, the Freemasons, the Odd Fellows, bowling clubs, etc. And we see that from World War II onward, these things have started to disintegrate. And I think it's largely because people have, for whatever reason, become more individualistic. You see people retreat to their homes, the home music setup, the television. Obviously, the television had huge material impact of just staying in. Being able to listen to CDs and albums. You used to think music used to be something that could only be created in the context of community. And you needed to have someone producing it, and it's a naturally sort of way of creating conversation, where now it's a form of consumption, in that I just pick the music I want to listen to, it's there, and it doesn't require me to be around people to create that music. And living in Scotland, you think of, and obviously this would be a class thing as well, but you think of during the winter months how important having access to ceilidhs and Scottish country dancing would have been. And it would have given a reason people to come, move around, interact with people, get to know people your own age, get to know older people, listen to music. And that would have been so stimulating, like any form of consumption that we have now at one point would have been tied to some sort of nourishing social benefit. And a lot of the ethologists, so a lot of the sort of, I guess you would call them evolutionary biologists of the previous 20th century, like Nico Tienenberg and Konrad Lorenz, and everything like that. They have this idea of surrogate behaviors, which is that it's possible to take behaviors that evolutionarily would have had some nourishing benefit, but now via consumerism and let's just call it like over individualization or commodification of things, all these things have been cut off. So all of a sudden they're no longer tied to beneficial things. I mean, maybe I've talked about this before, but you think of like pornography and the internet, it's disconnected people in a way from having romantic relationships with people. Facebook, all these things you can sort of get, you can get the sugary, hyper palatable, exaggerated version of friendship, of sexual companionship, of having community, all from your house without actually getting any of the benefits of that. So this is a roundabout way of saying, that Robert Putnam has talked about the importance of being engaged in something, just be a part of any kind of club, doesn't matter what it is. And he's recently had a new documentary come out called Join or Die, which is really talking about this. Just doesn't matter what it is, join a bowling club, join a parent teacher association, just get out and actually have that experience of working with people in real life.
Yeah. And I think that comes, it's kind of like the importance of identity to our existence, really, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think that's defined from identity politics, isn't it?
Yes.
But I think I remember a very striking example of this, which hit home. I was working in palliative care at the time in the hospice, and Rangers had got to the Europa League final, and I remember there was a number of kind of, it was men that were there that were kind of Rangers fans, and they were end of life in severe pain. But for the 90 minutes of the semi-final and then the final, the pain went.
Yeah.
Joe, and football has a real power.
Yes.
In that it gives identity.
Yes.
And it's distracting as well. I think
it's distracting, but maybe it's galvanizing, actually.
Yeah,
maybe it causes people to focus on something external. So it is a form of distraction, but something about having everybody distracted, or maybe a form of attention, and having everybody attending on one thing at the same time, obviously can be good or bad. You can look at the power of feeling like you're part of a club, and you can also look at football hooligans and firms and things like that. And obviously nationalism, religion, these are all things that are very powerful, and they're galvanizing organizational potential. And we see how they can be abused. And then I guess going back to CrossFit has done this very well, and it's given people something to converge on, something to attend to. And I think with identities, and I think this is another one of the things that the internet can do poorly, is I think that there's something different about local emergent grassroots identities, where you see people in your area and you come together and you join to do something, whether it's being part of, a gardening allotment, or being part of whatever, like a local soup kitchen or something. That's very, very different from going on the internet and picking and choosing an identity. And what I mean is, before when we were talking about positive and negative freedoms, freedom from and freedom to. But when you go on the internet, there's also different kinds of identities. There's inclusive and exclusive identities. And I think a lot of the way we do our sorting on the internet isn't based on just what we do like, which sometimes we do, like fandom and stuff like that, but it's also what we don't like.
Yeah.
And you look at social media, and social media is much more fed often by what you don't like. Whereas when you're just meeting people in a group, and it's like, you often don't know what the people do. You don't know what their political belief systems are. You just know that you're there to do something together, whether it's an Amish barn raising. And, so this is what backways. So like CrossFit really hit on something, which it got people away from the model of going to the gym, putting your headphones on, walking on the treadmill for 15 minutes, and then using these sort of very abstract machines, which further reduce your conception of the human body. We were talking about this sort of Cartesian reductionism. I'm going to do my biceps. I'm going to do my leg extensors. I'm going to do whatever movements. Where CrossFit, came in, we're going to work out together. They used to say your body is the machine, which is, I think, was a step in the right direction. We're going to we're going to do full body movements. We're going to have this sense of camaraderie. We're also going to have this sense of commiseration, because the workouts are quite miserable. Yeah. But at the end of it, you have this sense of bonding. Yeah. And they tapped into so much with that. And I think CrossFit really tapped into that. But one of their other slogans was forging elite fitness. And we talked about this in one of our first conversations. The idea of being elite means it's necessarily exclusive, which isn't bad, but means that CrossFit is not something that could scale up to larger communities because it is inherently exclusive.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of these things, there's not many of them are inherently bad. And I think that's the same with the internet. Is offered huge potential and huge positivities, and the same with social media. And the challenge is possibly not on an individual level; it's at an organizational level. To the algorithms that kind of manipulate us
Yes.
and feed that cycle. And so, one thing that I was doing a bit of work on yesterday was kind of social media in children. Because in Norway, they've just increased the ban to 15 years old.
Interesting.
So if you're
I hadn't heard that.
under 15, you are banned from using social media. And actually, I think these things probably do need institutional intervention, because if you're asking parents or schools to make these decisions, then you're creating challenges, because
Yes.
if one kid isn't allowed a phone while the schoolmates have them, then suddenly they're the odd one out.
Yes.
They're excluded, and they suffer as a consequence. So yeah, I think and maybe that's where the kind of maybe that's there's kind of a role of government here in terms of shaping policy to address this. And one of the things that actually struck me yesterday was a couple of years ago, there was a huge media and government debate around TikTok because of security concerns.
Yes.
But that same debate hasn't been replicated around health concerns in children.
Yeah.
And does that speak of the values that we hold of a society, that we're much quicker to take action if it impedes on our national security than if it impedes on our children's long-term mental and at times physical health?
It's interesting because people bristle at this thought of government paternalism, of telling people what they can and can't do. Do you know what I mean? So this idea of restricting social media usage or whatever, but people pretend that we're in this neutral environment where the government is the only entity that's acting on people's desires or what's accessible to them, or whatever affordances they have. But that's not true, because we have a multi-billion-dollar advertising and marketing industry that's also shaping people's beliefs. So it's like saying, well, it's not fair for the government to say that you can't smoke. And okay, I understand where people are coming from. But also you think that up until the 1990s, there was a huge constant advertising campaign for tobacco, so it's not as though if you take the government out of it, then all of a sudden people are back at neutral. It means that there's still going to be structures imposing on people. So I think people often forget that there are all these giant multi-billion-dollar bodies that have incentives to manipulate our behavior anyway. So I think trying to get people back to a neutral space where they can make their choices is really interesting. What you said about TikTok is also interesting, because for some reason TikTok seems to be a lightning rod for this kind of conversation. I think because of the perception that it's from the Chinese government, which is probably true. I mean, I'm not personally on TikTok, and I prefer my kids aren't on TikTok, but I'm also not really on any social media as much as I can help it. But you're right. We've sort of just decided that we're just going to run this longitudinal study to see what does social media do to people's brains. And I read a very unconvincing study the other day saying, oh, well, we found there's actually no correlation between mental health. They want to see if there's a dose response relationship between how much you use certain social media and self-reported mental health. And they said, actually, well, there's not. But I'm like, how do you actually get a clean control group for that anymore? Because everyone's on social media. And even if you yourself are not on social media, the belief systems and all the anxieties that are engendered by social media are still affecting you. Do you know what I mean? So like you can't opt out of it. And as to what you're saying about not giving to kids, our kids are still a bit young for it, but already there's this debate. Do your kids get a smartphone? Do your kids get to go on social media? And we don't, but like sometimes our kids feel like pariahs because everyone else has a Nintendo Switch and everyone else is playing these games and we're not. And it's like, is it fair to cut your kids off from what the norm is? So I think you're right. I think that we need to decide what we value as a society and decide,
because saying that it's free choice, saying you should let kids choose, that's ridiculous. You can't let a 5-year-old choose.
Yeah, I do think. Yeah, look, I'm on social media. I wrestle with the addiction. I know it is addictive, and I'm aware of the challenges that causes personally. I also think that, as consenting adults, we should probably be allowed to choose how we use social media. But children, it's a different kettle of fish, right? We don't let them consent to healthcare. We don't let them drive a car because it's dangerous. And so, if we're kind of, and maybe this comes to your point, there needs to be an evidence base for things.
I agree.
And I knew that might be challenging because waters are muddy in these type of research, and there might be actors trying to make the water muddy, and that was definitely an example of the research around smoking for a long time.
Yes.
And there's also possibly a public misunderstanding of what science is. I think science isn't fact. Science is a best guess. It's an interpretation of the evidence that we have.
Yeah.
And so science can change, and we as scientists are guilty of claiming that their hypotheses are factual because it's the world we live in. That's how we get likes and retweets. But actually, that's caused problems, and I think maybe that was part of the challenge with COVID, was that on Tuesday you're being told one thing, and on Thursday you're being told that the science showed something totally different. And so, if we believe science is fact, how can we, how can these two things hold up?
Yes,
they're different. And so, I think we need to be clear in how we communicate science.
Yeah, the communication is tough.
But communication is becoming more and more tough, right? Because there's so much information out there. We maybe even by this podcast we're adding more information to the ether, aren't we?
Yeah, it's very hard to create. I mean, that's it. I mean, a lot of people bemoan the disappearance of a consensus reality. And obviously, when you keep on adding in more and more points of view, you're right, it makes it much harder to hone in on something. And this is something we're dealing with. And, I used to hear this analogy quite a lot with social media and the internet. Maybe we've talked about this before, but people used to compare, or at least they used this analogy 10 years ago, where like, well, the internet is sort of like cities in the 1800s, where we didn't have sewage systems and we didn't know what to do with all the horse manure. And, we didn't have fire stations. We didn't have modern police forces, but see, people still came to the cities anyway. I mean, you could argue the enclosure movement moved that around, but let's say people chose to come to the cities because they saw opportunities and things like that, even though they knew they could die of cholera, or even though they could get hit by a horse cart or something.
Two things that seem in juxtaposition can exist simultaneously. And for social media, it has the potential for good. For at the same time, it's harmful. And we have to hold them both. Acknowledge them both, and maybe that's similar to the Industrial Revolution. And
that's it. Giving. And then 100 years later, we have fire departments. I would argue that we have a pretty good functioning police force overall. We have sewage systems, and we've created systems that seem to make it work. And so maybe social media, as we think about it now, it's in this transition period where we haven't actually figured out the best practices, or what I would say is we haven't really figured out a culture or a set of manners. Cultures develop manners to help us with ambiguities when we interact with each other, and to help us with confusing situations. So we start to internalize this.
Maybe
we haven't developed that yet.
Of sport, if you put 22 people on a grass field and gave them a ball, but gave them no rules, then then it would be carnage, right? Whereas if you suddenly give them the football rule book, then 22 people can have a really great time. And so we need the boundaries and the rules to facilitate engagement and
just to play devil's advocate here, if you gave people the ball and no rules, how long would it take them to develop some sort of sport that ended up looking quite a bit like football? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you give people the rule book, is that going to work as well as kind of giving people time to work out rules?
And I suppose then you end up with you've got rugby, you've got football, you have softball, you've got America, and so I suppose that sport is possibly an example of that, isn't it? That if you give people the environment, people will create rule books. They might be subtly different,
Yeah.
but they facilitate an evolution of hopefully positive things.
Yeah, and just to kind of circle back to what we were talking about, you said something earlier, not on the podcast, but we were drinking a coffee, and you were talking about just sort of sportification, or that's the term that I use, but you were kind of talking about how actually the way we think about movement and physical activity right now in some ways is kind of stymied um, by us really having this sort of top-down sports model that perhaps isn't serving people in a way. And it's kind of a weird pivot, but I'm going to go with it because you were talking about some interesting research coming from the Netherlands. Can you explain that? I found that really interesting.
So yeah, I kind of I should definitely like temper this by highlighting that as a kid all I did was play sport.
Okay.
And I played loads of football, loads of rugby, and I love it. That is that. But I'm very much aware that it's not for everyone. And in the UK, sport and sporting culture is very much tied to schools, and so you often play it at school. And what the evidence shows that there's a huge drop-off in participation in sports when people leave school. Whereas I think the Netherlands is often cited because a lot of the sport in the Netherlands is performed in sports clubs. They have these big intergenerational sports clubs where often they have multiple sports in the same club. So,
and these are physical clubs.
Yeah, so they're physical places and spaces where people meet, and they have you might play football and netball all under the same banner. There's a lot of different sports played under the same the kind of same banner.
It's interesting because I'm thinking now, and I'm thinking of my local leisure centre where we are in Scotland right now, and I was thinking how much the leisure centre in the UK has sort of internalized that individualistic model you were talking about, where you go, there's a little gym in there where you go to work out by yourself, and there's a pool where you largely go to swim laps by yourself. And actually, I'm thinking everything else. There's very few other opportunities to interact with each other. Yeah. Sorry, keep on going.
I'm maybe coming back to that. Maybe a club whereby you have it gives you an identity. So you support. If your club's called A, you support A at the football. You support A at the netball. You support A at the tennis. Right. And so you buy into the identity as a collective. But what's been shown is that there's a much lower dropout, because when you leave school, your sport's not tied to the school, so you just go from the under 18 club to the adult club or the under 23 club or whatever exists, and so there's an ongoing uptake. And maybe there's lots of forces at play. Maybe it's not just that it's tied to the school. There's the identity in sports an interesting thing. We briefly mentioned it, and I suppose that is a huge thing in the States, isn't it, with universities. But it's a really interesting model.
It's what's interesting in the States is how quickly people go from playing sports to very quickly shifting over to being spectators. Like even like you think of American university sports, they're so professionalized that a lot of universities, they might have a few clubs here or there, but when we think of university sports, we're thinking of essentially professional level athletes, professional athletes who maybe don't get paid but bring money into the university, but are working at very close to a professional level. What you're saying about the Dutch clubs is really interesting as well, because I'm just thinking about it now as a man who's in my 40s, and I've got a lot of friends, and I've kind of gotten over it now. But I have a lot of friends who are in my 30s, and they keep on going back to rugby, or they keep on going back to football, and they start playing with the local clubs, and they're playing with the guys who are in their early 20s, 21, 22, and they'll be playing for a few weeks, and they'll have an injury, and they're playing for a few weeks, and they have a really big injury, and then they'll take a month off or 2 months off, and they'll come back, and then they'll be out again. And it's interesting because almost because there are no opportunities for them that they perceive where they can play with people of similar ages, they keep on going back to joining where they have these opportunities with the clubs that sort of work with the 20-year-olds. Where if you had a club where you had cohorts that you could, and I'm not saying that like old people have to play with old people, but I'm saying that like me as a 40-year-old, I could see how it would be more appropriate for me to play with people in their early 50s and their late 30s, more so than playing with a bunch of 18-year-olds, because you kind of have different needs and different levels of intensity.
Yeah, I think the other thing that is really interesting about that, and possibly something that I've experienced, definitely my wife's experienced, is when you've played a sport to a high level. We all as humans, I think we probably desire some form of competency. It's very hard to often go back to that sport if you've not played it for a while, because you weren't as good as you were. But it's very hard to pick something up new. It's a very kind of unique mindset to say, well, actually, I'm gonna take this on, or try this new thing, because you need to go through the kind of learning cycles, and maybe we need to be much more generous to ourselves, but also to others in kind of in communities about being bad at things.
It's true. I mean, learning is so important, and that sense of learning, that sense of getting better is important. And we like to use the PERMA model. So PERMA looks at things like accomplishment and things like that, but also there's all these other models like Daniel Pink. He talks about competency, and I think Dechi and Ryan, this idea of progress and competency or mastery is so important. But obviously, it's a two-way street where giving people opportunities to learn and get better is really, really important. But then also trying to figure out how, as we get older, do we have space where people can have a sort of graceful decline? Do you know what I mean? Like, because I think sometimes, so again, guys in their 40s are often very dangerous because we still have a lot of capabilities. I still feel like I'm fast and I'm strong. I can do all these things, but I'm starting to notice that I am getting injured more, and part of that could be mindset. Part of it can also be me having a bit of ego in the way that I'm trying to train. I'm still trying to train like I'm 20, and maybe my recovery isn't quite as good. I just noticed that things that I would bounce back from, I'm maybe not bouncing. And if you had asked me 2 years ago, I'd say it's not true.
So do you think you're treating, coming back to what you said earlier, treating your body as an object as opposed to
that's interesting. Actually, that's really interesting. Treating your body as an object. Yeah, I think it needs to be a conversation with your body, and I think one needs to think about your goals and define your whys, because I'm treating my body, you're right, as sort of an object, pushing through the pain. It kind of comes from like my CrossFit background and things like that. Get the work done, your body is the machine, things like that. But also I need to interrogate what my goals are and why it is that I feel like sometimes I need to train like that. And I think it's just because it's what I've always done, because that I had meaning in that, and like my sense of identity was tied into being able to lift X amount of weight. Where now I think realistically, I still want to train hard. I still want to be strong, but I also want to focus on things like movement quality. We had this conversation about mobility earlier, and we found that we're both pretty ugly squatters naturally for whatever reason, whatever combination of hip and turn rotation and dorsiflexion and, who knows what, like when you start talking about hips and everything, it's very complicated. And I've always been able to ignore that. But now that I'm in my 40s, I think actually, you know what, I kind of want to get to the bottom of this and actually figure out where are some of these movement limitations coming from? Because in the past, I could just sort of power through them and not matter. But I think now that as my injury rate goes up, I think, you know what, maybe there's something to this. Maybe I should start to think about this. So you do a lot of work with community. I think you're a very good public communicator. I think, people know who you are, and they say very nice things. And I think you're doing a really good job of kind of tying this idea of physical activity and wellness in with medical professions, So what are some of the projects that you're working on, or what are you excited about right now?
Oh, thanks for saying that. It's kind of not sure. I'm just my skills passion really, but I suppose the couple of things we involved in a charity in Aberfeldy. It's called Healthiest Town. It's a bit grandiose, but it's basically aspiring to try and, under the context of making Aberfeldy Scotland's healthiest town, to address some of the barriers that we face, and I suppose trying to change culture in the town. So that's it's quite a nice way of embedding a lot of the research that I'm reading. Doing some research around physical activity promotion within healthcare settings. So what role, I suppose the big question is, what role, if any, do and should health professionals have in trying to help people become more active?
Yeah.
And there's some great examples of that. Parkrun and Parkrun Practice is a really good example. And yeah, so I think that's kind of that's where a lot of my research is, and a lot of the things I'm challenged on is the inequalities thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think how do we ensure that movements for all? I think lifestyle, I suppose I would probably describe myself as a lifestyle medic, but I think we got to be careful, because I think lifestyle as a phrase becomes at risk of being loaded for two reasons.
Yes.
First of all, blame, which
yes.
it shouldn't be about. It should really be about social determinants of health. It's not
Yes.
saying this is your fault. It's acknowledging that these things are complex and multifaceted, and engaging in that process of understanding with people. And although it's maybe not your fault, it's our problem as a collective. And the second thing that I think lifestyle is challenged by is its risk of corruption by commercialization.
Yes.
I think lifestyle is a very, whether you like it or not, sexy term, and it can and does make some people a lot of money, but yeah, that's something I struggle with, because I think that that's not what I see this, or what I'm trying to do as. In fact, it's the exact opposite, and so I really resent, the promises that this nutrition pill will
Yes.
if you just pay a tenner a pot, will make you healthier, or this shot to improve your gut microbiome.
Yeah.
So fingers pointed, will be of great value, because what I really think is about it is the day-to-day decisions we make, and they should be available to all. And also, I think acknowledging that these things are so complex. I don't think there's unhealthy decisions. I think there's a complex decision of unhealthy. Unhealthiness is a consequence of repeated decisions. So having fish and chips isn't necessarily bad for you. It's contextual. In fact,
Right.
A good example of that, I think, is a glass of wine. I think historically people used to think, maybe a glass of wine a night is good. I think the WHO have come out and been really clear in stating repeatedly that actually drinking wine is bad for you. And I agree with that. I think alcohol there's no safe limit. But whether we like it or not, alcohol is a social, or in our culture is a social binder.
Yes.
And so if one glass of wine means you twice a week means you spend a couple of hours with all your friends, then what is health? What is worse for your health than socializing or having a glass of wine?
I'm glad you said that, because when you were talking about that, I thought, I know what you mean, but then so often when we're thinking at this level, we can commit type 3 errors where I think we completely ignore perhaps the meaning or the why of an intervention, which is to say, you're right, alcohol, the whole French paradox thing, and one glass of red wine, et cetera. Obviously that's been overstated, but then if it leads to having a nice conversation with your friends and it gets people together, it is really, it just keeps on coming down to it's complicated, isn't it? And it's so contextual. I'm mindful of the fact that you need to go, so I want to ask you just one more question. So just imagine you're someone listening to this podcast and you live, let's say, in a rural village somewhere in Scotland, and you want to get some physical activity, some kind of social physical activity happening in your community. What can you do? Where can you go? Are there any programs you're excited about, or any opportunities? How do you make things start to happen? Because I know there's so many barriers, and I'd like to get you back to start talking about specific barriers, but I just want to focus on something positive. What can people do to enact positive change in their community?
Yeah, I think, great question. One thing that struck me time and again is how much is happening in my community, the communities in which I live, that I didn't or don't know about. And maybe you've seen it before. There's this amazing YouTube video of a guy dancing at a festival on his own,
Yes,
like a
yes,
lunatic,
yes,
right?
yes.
And then he's dancing on his own for ages. And then one person goes and joins him, and before you know it, everyone's over there. And so, actually, the early adopters have a lot of power. And maybe this is kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think the most important thing you can do is find out what's happening. Find out what's happening, and if there's something that's happening already, join and shape it.
Yeah.
I think I think sometimes we think that new is better. I think that is a mistake I've made too many times, and actually, Joe, we are much better in unity.
Yes. All right. Well, I think that's a really good place to stop, and I'd like to get you on again in a few months. To start talking about some of the research that about regarding enablers and barriers and things like that, because I think that's very interesting. But I think that's a good place to stop. Find out what's going on, and think about things on a community level.
Oh, thanks for having me. You made me sound like a thinking man, which I'm not sure I am, but yeah.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was my chat with Dr. Callum Leese. Like I said, we talked about a lot of topics. We fit a lot into the 40 minutes. I have put some links in the show notes, so if you want to learn more about his podcast, more about the BSLM, more about the Healthiest Town initiative, or some of the research that he's done, go ahead and do that. I've also linked to some of the research that he mentioned, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. And as always, if you have any questions, send them over our way, and we'd be happy to talk about it.